Someone tells you to hurt a stranger, a person you've never met sitting in the next room who has done nothing wrong. You'd say no. Of course you'd say no. You're not that kind of person. But the real answer is far stranger than you want to believe. Because in 1961, a psychologist at Yale University ran an experiment that changed everything we thought we knew about human nature. And the results didn't just describe a few bad apples. They described you. Picture a room, a single chair, a desk, a machine with a row of switches labeled from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. Above the highest switches, 2 words printed in red: danger, severe shock. You sit down in that chair. A man in a white lab coat stands beside you. He tells you you're part of a study on learning and memory. In the next room, there's another person strapped to a chair, electrodes on their wrist. Your job is simple. Ask them a question. If they get it wrong, press a switch. Increase the voltage with every wrong answer. The man in the white coat does not ask you to do anything extreme. He simply tells you the study requires you to continue. Stanley Milgram designed this experiment after watching the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the Holocaust, who sat in a glass booth in Jerusalem and explained calmly and repeatedly that he was just following orders. Milgram wanted to know how many ordinary Americans would do the same. He predicted maybe 1 in 100, maybe 2. He was wrong by a factor of 65. 65% of participants administered what they believed was a 450-volt shock to a stranger. They heard screaming from the next room. They heard the person beg them to stop. They heard silence, which was somehow worse than the screaming. And still, when the man in the white coat said continue, most of them continued. This is the part that stops people cold. Because these weren't soldiers following military orders. These weren't people who had been brainwashed or threatened. They were volunteers. Ordinary men and women who had answered a newspaper ad and come in on a Tuesday afternoon. They showed up, they sat down, and they electrocuted a stranger because a man in a lab coat told them to. And here's the thing that makes it stranger still. They didn't want to. Almost every participant showed signs of extreme distress. Sweating, trembling, nervous laughter. Many of them openly argued with the experimenter. Several begged to stop. One man told Milgram's team that he couldn't continue, that this was wrong, that he felt sick doing it. And then, when the experimenter said simply, "Please continue," he continued. The cruelty wasn't the point. The compliance was. Milgram himself spent years trying to understand exactly what mechanism was operating inside his participants. What he eventually described was something he called the agentic state, a shift that happens inside a person's mind when they place themselves inside a legitimate hierarchy. When someone with perceived authority gives you a direct instruction, something in your psychology steps back. You stop experiencing yourself as the author of your own actions. You become, in your own mind, an instrument rather than an agent. The moral weight of what you're doing transfers, in your own internal accounting, to the person above you in the chain. This is not cowardice. It's not stupidity. It's a feature. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm, who spent decades studying the evolution of human social behavior, argues that the capacity for hierarchy and deference to authority wasn't a weakness grafted onto our nature. It was adaptive. Groups that could coordinate around a shared authority structure hunted more effectively, defended territory more successfully, and survived conditions that scattered uncoordinated groups. The ability to fall in line, to suppress individual impulse and deference to a leader's direction, was a survival advantage for hundreds of thousands of years. Your ancestors who were most willing to follow authority lived longer. Their genes are your genes. But here is where Milgram's experiment becomes more than just a dark, historical footnote. Because he didn't just run it once. He ran it dozens of times, changing one variable at a time to see exactly what made the difference. When he moved the experiment to a rented office building instead of Yale University, compliance dropped, but didn't disappear. The white coat mattered more than the institution. When he put the learner in the same room as the teacher, so they could see each other's faces, compliance dropped significantly. Physical proximity to the person you're hurting makes it harder to continue. When he had 2 experimenters who openly disagreed with each other about whether to continue, every single participant stopped. The moment authority fractured, obedience collapsed. And when he added 2 other fake participants who visibly refused to continue before the real participant's turn, compliance dropped to just 10%. Watching someone else say no made it vastly easier to say no yourself. These findings rewrote the psychology of moral courage. Disobedience isn't primarily a product of strong individual character. It's social. It's contagious. One person who visibly refuses to comply creates a permission structure that makes it possible for others to follow. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who would later run his own infamous Stanford prison experiment, spent years studying the conditions that produce both cruelty and heroism. His work suggests that the same situational forces that pull people toward obedience can, under different conditions, pull them toward resistance. The key is almost never the individual's values in isolation. It's the situation. It's whether the system makes it easy or hard to see yourself as responsible. This is why Milgram's experiment is uncomfortable in a way that goes beyond the footage of trembling participants at a switchboard. It's uncomfortable because the mechanism it revealed is still running. It runs in workplaces where harmful policies continue because no one feels individually responsible for the outcome. It runs in organizations where a chain of orders separates every person from the consequences of what they're collectively producing. It runs anywhere a uniform or a title or a clipboard confers enough authority to shift the psychological weight of action away from the person performing it. You have almost certainly been inside this mechanism, not in a dramatic way, not with electric shocks and screaming, but in a meeting where you said nothing, in a process you followed without questioning, in a moment where someone above you said continue, and something in you did, even when something else in you hesitated. The agentic state is not an aberration. It's a default. And yet, Milgram's variations show something equally important. The default can be interrupted. Physical proximity to the person affected, fractured authority, one visible act of refusal. These things change everything. The experiment that proved you're wired to obey also proved, almost accidentally, that you're wired to follow the person who refuses first. So the next time someone in a white coat, metaphorical or otherwise, tells you simply to continue, you'll know what's actually happening inside you. It's not weakness. It's 100,000 years of survival wiring doing exactly what it was built to do. The question is whether you're the one who keeps pressing the switch, or the one who stands up first and says no. Because in Milgram's data, there was always at least one person in the room who stopped. Someone always said no. And when they did, the experiment changed. Someone tells you to hurt a stranger, you'd say no. Of course you'd say no. Now you know exactly how hard that actually is, and exactly what it takes to make it possible.